Shabbat Shalom and good morning. When was the last time you were surprised by something? And I don't mean something like a surprise party, though how often is there a little birdie who can't help but share that surprise in advance, but a real moment when you had to step back and reconsider what was right in front of you. Maybe you even said a quiet, wow, look at that. God had that. Just last week in reading the creation story, it was right there in the text, so subtle that maybe you missed it, but God did not. It read, God saw that it was good. And it doesn't sound like much, but it was a surprise, even to the one who made it. So the thinking goes, if God is the prime mover, the creator and author of all, wouldn't God know that what God had created was good? Maybe God intended it to be, just okay or sufficient or good enough. But it was more. I see that moment kind of like a baker who pauses to taste their cake and says aloud with a bit of pride, now that is good. And in my opinion, it wasn't just a self-congratulatory, good job, God, pat on the back. No, I think that God was taken by surprise. And so imagine God's disappointment reflected in our portion, Noah, when God saw how corrupt the earth had become, now filled with lawlessness. God uses the same verb. God saw. Again, if we extrapolate from last week's reaction, what God saw even surprised God. In most contexts, the one who is the host usually calls the rules. So if we wanted to play fair, we might think that the one who creates has the authority to destroy. But this is not like taking your toys and going home after a misunderstanding. This is creation we're talking about. Capital C. People, animals, nature, a world of beauty, albeit one that is imperfect, marred by misbehavior, by cruelty and lawlessness. That's what God saw. And what do we see? Most recently, an oil spill threatening wildlife and wetlands, to say nothing of the ocean waters. Glaciers receding, water levels rising, severe weather, from droughts to floods to firestorms, emissions, destruction of the rainforest. This past week, federal wildlife officials noted that 22 animals and 1 plant to be declared extinct. And that includes 11 birds, 8 freshwater mussels, 2 fish, and a bat. We know climate change is serious and that we have no choice but to engage it. But how? When it seems so much larger than any individual can handle. As Eliza noted, when Noah faced disastrous climate change, he acted solely in his own best interests, both before and after the flood. Even though the earth was returned to its former state of creation, Noah remained relatively unchanged by his experiences. And while it seems like he didn't grow as a person, his example teaches us to recognize our responsibility to the larger family of humanity as we create a path to a sustainable future. Nothing we can create is as precious as what God has created for us. Think about the beauty that nature provides in our lives, how essential it is for our mental health and well-being, how much pleasure we derive from it, whether it's a walk in the woods or the seashore, or the simplest moments of nature available in our own neighborhood, no matter our address. Admiring how the world wakes up to the colors of creation every day, and how the setting sun paints those waning minutes with the vivid promise that tomorrow will renew all that we cherish. This sense of joy in nature, in God's world, in wonder, is part of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's theology of wonder, awareness, and the keen appreciation, awe really, for God's creation and creations. Wonder means that we don't take things for granted. Mindful of all that is around us, we can continue to be surprised. Isn't it only after we return home from the beach that we really appreciate the feeling of water against our skin, washing away all of the sand and salt that has stuck to the sunscreen? And in that moment, we are suddenly aware of and give thanks for the gift of water. Once we're refreshed, do we pause to consider the countless other moments in a single day, washing our face or filling our water bottles, that water is equally miraculous? For now it runs from our faucets with no effort on our part. Water is the key element in Noah's story. It was meant to wash away corruption and lawlessness, seen reflected in the earth itself, wash away and renew. In fact, water is an essential part of the Jewish experience. In our history, parting the waters of the Red Sea led to freedom and our covenant with God. Ultimately, our ancestors crossed the Jordan to arrive at the Promised Land. And in our daily life, the liturgy reminds us that water, in the right measure, is critical. What do I mean by the right measure? Not so much that the crops would be flooded, and just enough that they can continue to grow. It's only water, right? But as we've seen in the streets of our own city, the amount can be the difference between thriving and suffering. Our ancestors had to pay attention to that because their very lives were dependent on the natural world, which is why water merits a daily blessing in our worship as an expression of awe that nature functions in a predictable way. What if we paid attention in the same way to simple things, to the things that were important but somehow usually overlooked? It's human nature to become accustomed to many things, but look at it this way. For the one who has fasted a single day, as on Yom Kippur, you can't tell them that a cup of coffee or a bagel with a schmear doesn't rise to that level of blessing. And I don't mean to be trite, but in that moment, it's absolutely heavenly. How can we recapture that sense of gratitude and carry it over to the next day and every day after? Tradition teaches us it is through blessing, which is really all about being mindful. When we bless, before we eat or at other times, we are pausing to reflect on what is before us and what it took to make it so. Thereafter, each time we say those same words of blessing, we renew that connection. Our goal, as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel asserts, should be to live our life in radical amazement, to get up in the morning and look at the world in a way that takes nothing for granted. Prayer gives us the vocabulary of wonder as well as the understanding of our responsibility. Because it isn't enough to praise. When we cherish something, we want to care for it. Awe, delight, amazement gives rise to a sense of protectiveness. As natural resources diminish, it's only natural to treasure them more. Heschel made this observation decades ago. As civilization advances, he said, the sense of wonder declines. Mankind will not perish for want of information, but only for lack of appreciation. The beginning of our happiness lies in the understanding that life without wonder is not worth living. Rabbi Jack Stern recounts an incident he observed when he and his wife were taking a walk one day in Jerusalem, and nearby were a mother and her toddler. The mother was clearly in a hurry, but her child trailed behind her. She turned back several times as if to indicate to him that she was waiting. And finally, she walked back to where her son was standing, motionless and quiet, watching in wonder at the sight of a caterpillar winding its way across the leaf of a bush. Annoyed by his dawdling, the mother scolded him for not keeping up, whereupon the child toddled to his mother's side, and the two of them rushed off to their next pressing appointment. And Rabbi Stern wrote, "We saw it all, a mother and child standing in silent awe at the miracle of God's creation. And you can only ask, what destination of hers could have been so important to make her snatch this opportunity from her child? What reason was good enough for closing that door through which she could have beheld the wonder of her own child, who was wide-eyed at the wonder of the universe?" We don't want to live in a world in which we tell our children and grandchildren that we wish they could have experienced the joy of climbing on a glacier, or tasting fresh water, or walking in a rainforest, or watching a caterpillar crawl across a leaf. If it fills us with wonder, if we value it, we will work to keep it. So let us renew our hope as we bless this moment of joy together